In this video, you're going to learn how to choose the best MIDI keyboard for your church on any budget in 2019. Hey everyone, I'm David from Sunday Sounds, where we believe in making software like MainStage and Ableton Live fun and easy to use for worship musicians. In today's video, you're going to learn how to cut through the hype and pick a MIDI keyboard that's actually going to serve your church's needs without breaking the budget. Now, before we jump into the video, if you're a worship leader or worship musician playing at church, we are producing free video content just like this video several times a week. So be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss all of our future worship keys, worship guitar, and gear videos. Okay, so today we're gonna help you figure out the best MIDI controller for your worship keys setup at church. Now, my first piece of advice for you if you're considering buying a new MIDI controller is don't buy a MIDI controller. Now, okay, well then why are we shooting this video? Let me explain what I mean. Maybe you should buy a MIDI controller, but before you plan on spending any budget dollars on buying something new or even something used, I would encourage you to look at the keyboard or keyboards that you already have at your church. If you're looking to set up a software keys rig in MainStage, Ableton Live, or any other software, there's a really good chance that the keyboard you already have can be used as a MIDI controller. Even if it's an older keyboard, as long as it has a MIDI port on the back, then you can connect it to your Mac or to your PC to use with MainStage or Ableton Live. So, if you have a compelling reason to buy a new MIDI controller, if your keyboard has broken keys, if somebody else is using it, or if you just feel that you need to take a step forward into the modern world with a brand new MIDI controller, then this video is going to help you navigate that. So once you've decided that you're ready to buy a MIDI controller, the first thing you need to figure out is how much money do you have to spend on something new? How big is your budget? Because you can spend $50 on a MIDI controller, or you could spend $5,000 on a MIDI controller, or a large range in between. And if you don't know how much money you're looking to spend, then it's going to be really easy for you to get overwhelmed by lots of options that you might not even be able to afford when it comes time to buy. I also want to really quickly address that oftentimes you can get a lot more for your money if you're willing to go in the used market. And oftentimes with used keyboards or MIDI controllers, they're going to be in pretty darn good condition more often than not, because a lot of keyboards don't get moved around a lot, and when they do, they get treated with a good amount of care. So if you're willing to, you can save a lot of money or get more for your dollar by going on the used market. So that's the first thing, is figure out how much money you actually have available to spend, because that's how you're going to filter through all of the other considerations that we're going to talk about in this video. After you figure out your budget, the next step you need to decide on is, do I need this MIDI keyboard to have built-in sounds or not? Some folks really believe that it's absolutely important to have a keyboard or a MIDI controller with built-in sounds as a backup plan in case your software rig were to ever freeze or fail during a live performance. If you choose to shop for a keyboard with built-in sounds, there's a wide range of prices, from low-end keyboards with fewer high-quality sounds all the way up to super high-end performance workstation keyboards that have amazing built-in sounds but cost a lot more money. Me personally, I've performed live with a MainStage or Ableton rig for 6+ years, and I've never used a backup keyboard with built-in sounds. My personal opinion is that I would rather spend that budget on upgrading my computer so that it's way less likely to fail than investing a lot of money in what's a backup plan that you're not going to be using 99.9% of the time. But only you can figure out the specifics of your circumstance. Some churches really like to have a keyboard with built-in sounds, so if the Mac ever needs to go with somebody while they're working somewhere else, or if they have a guest who's not comfortable using MainStage, they can just turn on the keyboard and use the built-in sounds. But you need to figure out if built-in sounds are important to you, because there's a big price difference between a similar quality of keyboard that has or doesn't have built-in sounds. So figure that out now, because it's going to make it way easier for you to identify your options in the later steps. The next step is to figure out how many keys you need your keyboard to have. Traditional piano players are probably going to want a full 88 key range, but if you're using this keyboard for synth parts, organ parts, or pads, you can probably get away with 61 and still have enough range to hit most of the common piano voicings. My recommendation is to avoid a 49 key keyboard unless you're going to be using it as a secondary keyboard alone. So you have to figure out if you need all 88 or not. Generally, 88 key keyboards are going to cost more than smaller keyboards, which makes sense. There's just more keys, there's more to the hardware. So figure out how many keys your keyboard needs to have. And if you're the worship leader buying this keyboard for people on your team, maybe take a second to ask the people who will be using it if they have a strong preference. Next, you need to figure out what kind of key bed you want your controller to have. If you're not familiar with that term, a key bed simply means how the keys feel as you play them. Traditional piano players are going to be most comfortable with a weighted key bed. That means that the keys actually have a little bit of weight and resistance designed to feel similar to how an actual piano would respond as you move the keys. So if you have somebody who's classically trained, who's used to playing piano, this is going to feel most natural to them. Now, weighted keyboards tend to be the most expensive type of key bed because they're a little bit more mechanically complex and there's a little bit more weight to the components themselves. But for piano players, oftentimes this is a must for it to actually feel like an authentic experience. Weighted keys might not make the most sense for you if you plan to play a large majority of synth lead, organ, or pad parts, because when you're trying to play faster or more complex voicings, sometimes that extra resistance and weight actually slows you down or makes it harder for you to pull those parts off live. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you have synth-weighted key beds. Now these, for lack of a better term, feel light and sort of plasticky. There's very little resistance or weight to the keys. They're very fast and very responsive. To a piano player, it's going to feel like a toy piano. It's probably not the right action for a piano-based sort of keys rig, but if you plan to play lots of lead parts, organ parts, or synth parts, that really light, responsive action will help you play those parts with greater accuracy with less effort to move the keys. So those are the two opposite ends of the spectrum. Then in the middle, you have what's called a semi-weighted key bed. This is my personal preference when I need to split the difference between those two types of playing styles. If I know I'm going to be playing some synth lead parts and also having to play piano during a time of underscoring, rather than having two separate keyboards to do those things, I like to go with a semi-weighted keyboard. So there's some resistance, there's some weight to the keys, but it's not as much as a weighted keyboard, and it's not as light or plasticky as a synth-weighted key bed. So a semi-weighted keyboard might be a good fit for you if you have a lot of different styles you plan to play on one keyboard. Semi-weighted is also a good option if you just can't afford a weighted key bed, but you want it to feel as responsive and natural to a piano player as possible. So this keyboard I have right here is semi-weighted. It's a full 88. It feels close enough to a piano for me to be able to actually still express and be responsive dynamically with piano, and it's not nearly as expensive as most fully weighted key beds. The last thing to consider when shopping for a MIDI keyboard is if you can anticipate needing any additional features or controls on the keyboard. On one side of the spectrum, you have really simple MIDI controllers without extra bells and whistles, generally just keyboard, a sustain input, maybe a mod wheel, and a pitch bend. On the other end of the spectrum are MIDI controllers with tons of additional knobs, faders, buttons, drum pads, extra expression port inputs, and there's all sorts of space in between with just a few faders, a few knobs. So you might feel like, well, more is more. I guess I'll just get the controller with as many knobs and faders on it as I can afford. But you have to figure out the actual use case for you and how you're practically going to integrate this new MIDI controller into your existing keys rig. If you're setting up a software rig for the first time, then you might not really be able to fully anticipate how you or your volunteers are going to interact with the software that you use. So try and project ahead and figure out how much tactile control you want, how much your volunteers are going to be able to handle, and try and find a keyboard that sort of suits that and also leaves a little room for potential growth moving forward. My personal preference is to use a pretty stripped down MIDI keyboard and then set a simple MIDI controller on top of it, like the Korg Nano Control 2. I take my Nano Control with me everywhere I go. Whichever keyboard I'm using, I just set it right on top and plug it in, and I know that I am comfortable with how the Nano Control 2 works. It's really inexpensive and lightweight. But it's two things to worry about, two things to plug in, two things to get comfortable with. So for your use case, it might make more sense to get one all-in-one controller, or you might want the future expandability of something simple that you can add additional MIDI controllers to. If you're not sure whether or not you should prioritize getting more onboard controls, my recommendation and personal opinion would be I'd rather spend more money on getting a higher quality key bed and a more rugged controller with just the right number of keys for me than spending money just to get some extra bells and whistles. I've never once used a drum pad during a live performance, but I've played lots of keyboards that have drum pads on them. So if it were me, I'd probably put that budget towards upgrading my laptop, maybe getting a separate MIDI controller to sit on top of whatever keyboard I'm using, and prioritizing a higher quality key bed. Now, the one exception I'll make to that is whatever keyboard I use and whatever keyboard you buy, make sure that it has a really solid and well-positioned mod wheel. I love to use the mod wheel. We use the mod wheel in everything we do at Sunday Sounds to give you a single hands-on control that you can do a lot of different cool things with. And even here in 2019, some manufacturers are not including mod wheels in some of their MIDI controllers, or they're putting them in goofy places like all the way up in the top left corner of the keyboard where it's really hard to reach in the moment. So that's one thing I would say that is sort of a hill to die on for me, is if I'm gonna buy a MIDI controller, it has to have a nice responsive, high quality mod wheel in a convenient and ergonomic position so I can actually use it well during a live performance. If you'd like a little bit more help choosing the right MIDI keyboard for you, we'll include a link in the description of this video to a helpful tool on our website called Gear Finder that lets you sort popular MIDI keyboards by price, key bed, number of keys, all of the considerations from this video. So if you need a little more help, go ahead and click the link to head over to Gear Finder. If this video was helpful to you, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the future Worship Keys tutorials that we put out. And if you'd like to support us here at Sunday Sounds, consider sharing this video with a friend of yours that you think would also find it helpful. Thanks for watching.